The sprawling campus of the Intergalactic Academy of Knowledge shimmered under the twin suns of a distant star system. Students from dozens of species bustled through its wide halls, their languages blending into a strange, melodic hum. For many, this was the pinnacle of education, a place where the brightest minds in the galaxy came together to study. But for one human student, this place felt like a labyrinth of impossible challenges. The student, a young man with a messy head of dark hair and tired eyes, sat slumped in the back row of his quantum mathematics class. The room was massive, designed to accommodate species of all shapes and sizes, from the towering crystalline cathars to the tiny bird-like Frixlians. The air buzzed with holographic displays of equations so complex they might as well have been ancient runes. At the front of the room stood the professor, a being unlike any other in the galaxy. Her silver-toned skin shimmered as if it were made of liquid metal, and her violet eyes glowed faintly, giving her an otherworldly aura. She wore a long, flowing garment that seemed alive, its fabric shifting colors like a moving nebula. Her voice, calm yet commanding, resonated through the classroom, pulling everyone's attention to the complex formula she was sketching in midair using a beam of light from her fingertips. The professor was a legend. Known for her brilliance and unorthodox teaching methods, she had a reputation for producing top-tier graduates. But she was also known for being ruthlessly demanding. As the lecture ended, students began filing out, some excitedly discussing the day's lesson while others appeared more anxious. The human student lingered at his desk, staring at the holographic equations that still hovered in the air. No matter how hard he tried, the concepts just wouldn't stick. Quantum mathematics wasn't just hard. It felt like it was written for minds that thought in dimensions he couldn't even imagine. Still here, the professor's voice broke through his thoughts. He flinched and turned to see her standing a few feet away, arms crossed, her glowing eyes fixed on him. She was taller than most humans, and her presence felt both intimidating and magnetic. I don't get it," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "No matter how much I study, it doesn't make sense." Her expression softened slightly, though there was still a hint of sternness. "You're struggling." He nodded, feeling the weight of her gaze. "If I fail this class, I'll lose my scholarship." The professor tilted her head, considering him for a moment. "Then we need to ensure you don't fail," she said matter-of-factly. "Come to my office after class tomorrow. I have a proposal for you." The student blinked, confused. "A proposal?" "You'll see," she said cryptically before walking away, her shimmering garment trailing behind her like a comet's tail. The next day, the student found himself standing in front of her office door. It was sleek and metallic, adorned with symbols from her homeworld. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The office was unlike anything he'd ever seen. It was vast, with walls lined by floating bookshelves that seemed to defy gravity. Strange, glowing artifacts hovered in glass cases, and the ceiling displayed a swirling map of stars that shifted whenever he moved. At the center of the room was a desk made of a translucent material, glowing faintly. The professor stood beside the desk, her arms folded. "You're on the verge of failing, yes?" she asked without preamble. He nodded. "I've tried everything. Studying, practice exams. Nothing works." "That's because you're thinking like a human," she said. He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She gestured to one of the glowing artifacts on the shelves. "Your brain is wired for linear thought, cause and effect. But quantum mathematics operates in a space where time and logic don't behave the way you expect. You're trying to run uphill in a storm. It's not your fault. It's your biology." Her words stung, but they also made sense. "So what can I do?" She gave him a faint smile. "I have a method. It's experimental, and it's not exactly standard. But if you're willing to take the risk, it might just save you." "What kind of risk?" he asked, his voice hesitant. The professor walked to her desk and pressed a hand against its surface. A holographic interface sprang to life, displaying a swirling, complex diagram that looked like a mix between a brain scan and a star map. "This," she said, "is a neural simulation linked directly to my mind. It's a training ground I've created, designed to teach students by immersing them in the concepts they struggle with, but no human has ever attempted." The students stared at the display, equal parts intrigued and terrified. "And if I fail in there?" Her glowing eyes locked onto his. "Then you'll fail here too. But if you succeed, you'll gain more than just passing this course. You'll gain understanding." He swallowed hard. He didn't have much of a choice. "I'll do it," he said finally. The professor nodded, her expression unreadable. "Good. Come prepared tomorrow. We begin at sunrise." And with that, his journey into the unknown began. The following morning, the student arrived at the professor's office just as the twin suns rose over the horizon, casting long golden beams through the academy's glass corridors. He felt a mix of nerves and determination. If this experimental method was his last chance, he had to give it everything he had. The door slid open with a faint hiss, and he stepped inside. The office looked different today. The usual floating shelves and star maps were gone, replaced by a single chair at the center of the room. It was sleek and metallic, connected to a massive console that pulsed with faint blue light. The professor stood beside the chair, her glowing violet eyes scanning a holographic display. Her shimmering outfit today was more streamlined, as though designed for practicality rather than flair. She turned to face him, her expression calm but serious. "You're on time." "That's a good start," she said. He managed a nervous smile. "What happens now?" "You'll be connected to my neural network," she explained, gesturing to the chair. "Once the link is established, you'll enter a simulation built from my own memories and knowledge. It's designed to challenge you, teach you, and force your mind to adapt to alien concepts." The student hesitated, glancing at the chair. "And it's safe, right?" The professor raised an eyebrow. "Safe is a relative term. The simulation is intense, and failure can have mental repercussions. But you seem resilient." He wasn't sure if that was meant to be reassuring, but he nodded. "Okay, let's do this." The professor motioned for him to sit. As he lowered himself into the chair, its curved surface adjusted to fit him perfectly. Thin metallic bands extended from the sides, gently wrapping around his wrists and forehead. "You'll feel a slight pressure at first," the professor said as she pressed a series of buttons on the console. "Then, your mind will transition into the simulation. Stay focused and trust your instincts." Before he could respond, the bands emitted a soft hum. A wave of warmth spread through his body, followed by a strange, tingling sensation. His vision blurred, and the world around him seemed to dissolve into a swirl of colors and light. When his vision cleared, he found himself standing in a completely different world. The simulation was breathtaking. He stood on a floating island suspended in a sky that shifted between shades of deep purple and gold. Giant crystals jutted out of the ground, glowing softly and humming with energy. The air felt both familiar and alien, carrying a faint metallic scent. In the distance, other islands floated lazily, connected by shimmering bridges of light. "This is incredible," he whispered, turning in place. The professor's voice echoed around him, calm yet commanding. "Welcome to the neural simulation. What you see is a reflection of my homeworld, at least as my mind remembers it. Every detail here is designed to challenge and teach you." He looked around but couldn't see her. "Where are you?" "I'm here, but not physically," she replied. "Think of me as your guide. Now, let's begin the first trial." Before he could ask what that meant, one of the glowing crystals nearby began to rise into the air. It rotated slowly, its surface covered in intricate alien symbols that pulsed with light. "The first trial tests your ability to think beyond linear logic," the professor's voice explained. "Human minds are wired to solve problems step by step. But here, time and causality don't follow your rules. You must solve the puzzle by thinking as an alien would." The crystal emitted a series of tones, and symbols began rearranging themselves in midair. It looked like a puzzle, but the patterns made no sense to him. He furrowed his brow, trying to analyze it. Minutes passed, and frustration built. "None of this makes sense," he exclaimed. "That's because you're still thinking like a human," the professor said. "You must stop looking for a pattern and instead feel the solution. Let the symbols guide you." He stared at the floating symbols, his mind racing. Feel the solution. What did that even mean? Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes and let the tones and symbols wash over him. Slowly, an idea began to form, not a logical one, but an instinctual understanding. Without fully knowing why, he reached out and touched one of the symbols. It glowed brightly, and the entire crystal responded, rearranging itself into a new configuration. The tones shifted, becoming harmonious. When he opened his eyes, the crystal floated back down, pulsing gently. The first trial was complete. "Well done," the professor's voice said, and there was a hint of approval in her tone. "You've taken your first step toward thinking beyond human limitations." The student smiled, a small spark of confidence igniting within him. But before he could celebrate, the ground beneath him shifted, and the floating island began to dissolve. The simulation was changing, pulling him into the next trial. "Stay focused," the professor warned. "This is only the beginning." As the world around him transformed into something even stranger and more challenging, he braced himself. If this was just the start, he couldn't imagine what was coming next. But one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. The floating island dissolved into a swirl of colors, leaving the student feeling weightless. For a brief moment, he floated in a void of shimmering blues and silvers, unsure of where he was or what would come next. Then, with a sudden jolt, the world around him reformed. He found himself standing in a strange chamber. The walls appeared to be made of a smooth, translucent material that pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of a living creature. The floor was covered in a grid of glowing tiles, each one marked with alien symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer as he looked at them. In the center of the room stood a massive floating crystal, similar to the one he'd seen earlier but much larger. Its surface was covered in swirling patterns that glowed with an eerie light. Around the crystal, smaller fragments floated in perfect synchronization, as if they were orbiting it. "This is the first major trial," the professor's voice echoed around him. It wasn't coming from any specific direction, but seemed to surround him. "Here, you will be tested on your ability to think beyond human logic." The student took a cautious step forward, staring at the floating crystal. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered. The professor's voice was calm but firm. "Your instincts will guide you if you let them. Remember, linear thinking won't work here. The solution exists, but it won't reveal itself to brute force or rigid analysis. You must adapt." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Easier said than done. The crystal emitted a low hum, and suddenly, the floating fragments began to move. They rotated around the central crystal, each one glowing brighter as they sped up. The symbols on the tiles beneath his feet began shifting as well, forming intricate patterns that seemed to mock his attempts to understand them. He crouched down, studying the tiles. At first glance, the symbols looked random, but as he focused, he began to notice faint connections between them. Certain shapes seemed to mirror others, while some tiles pulsed in sync with the orbiting fragments. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked, frustration creeping into his voice. The professor didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her tone was softer, almost encouraging. "Stop trying to control the puzzle. Let it show you what it needs." The student frowned, unsure what she meant. Let it show him. How could a puzzle reveal itself? Taking a deep breath, he stood up and closed his eyes. He blocked out the swirling lights and the shifting symbols, focusing instead on the sounds, the low hum of the crystal, the faint chimes of the floating fragments, and the rhythmic pulses of the tiles. Slowly, he began to feel a strange rhythm, as though the puzzle itself had a heartbeat. He opened his eyes and stepped onto one of the glowing tiles. The moment his foot touched it, the fragment closest to him glowed brighter, and the symbol beneath him shifted again. Encouraged, he stepped onto another tile, watching as another fragment reacted. Piece by piece, he began to see how the tiles and fragments were connected. Each step created a chain reaction, altering the pattern of symbols and the movement of the fragments. It wasn't about logic, it was about harmony. After what felt like an eternity, he stepped onto a final tile. The entire chamber lit up with a brilliant flash, and the crystal in the center emitted a clear, resonating tone. The fragments stopped spinning and floated back into place around the crystal, their glow fading. The student stepped back, breathing heavily but feeling a surge of pride. "Well done," the professor's voice said, and for the first time, he thought he heard a note of genuine approval. "You've completed the first trial." Before he could respond, the room began to shift again. The walls rippled like water, and the floor dissolved beneath his feet. He was falling, not in panic, but in a strange, weightless drift. As the world around him reshaped itself once more, the professor's voice returned, more serious now. "You've proven that you can adapt to unfamiliar logic. But the next trial will be different. It won't just test your mind, it will test your resilience." He landed gently on what felt like solid ground, though the environment around him was shrouded in a thick, glowing mist. He could barely make out the shapes of tall, twisted structures in the distance, their outlines pulsing faintly with light. "What do you mean, resilience?" he asked, his voice echoing in the emptiness. The mist began to part, revealing a vast, alien battlefield. The ground was cracked and scorched, and the air was filled with the faint sound of distant explosions. In the sky above, strange ships darted back and forth, their movements erratic and chaotic. The professor's voice was grim. "This is a memory. One of mine." The student froze. "A memory? Why?" "To understand the next challenge," she replied, "you must walk through my past. What you see here is not just a trial. It is a glimpse of what shaped me." The student swallowed hard, staring at the desolate landscape before him. The floating crystals and glowing tiles suddenly seemed far less intimidating compared to this. But there was no turning back now. He took a deep breath and stepped forward into the unknown. The mist swirled around him as the desolate battlefield came into focus. The ground was jagged and cracked, littered with strange metallic debris that seemed to hum faintly with leftover energy. The sky above was a chaotic mix of red and black, with flashes of light from the distant ships streaking through the gloom. The student took a cautious step forward, feeling the crunch of alien soil beneath his feet. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of burnt metal and something sharper, almost acidic. He glanced around, his nerves on edge. "This was a war," the professor's voice echoed, calm but somber. "My people's war, fought long before I became what I am today. What you see is a fragment of that time, a memory burned into my mind." He swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Why are you showing me this? What does this have to do with my trial?" "Because resilience is not learned in comfort," she replied. "To understand the lesson, you must endure what I endured. This is more than a test of logic or skill. It is a test of your spirit." The ground shook suddenly, a distant explosion rumbling across the battlefield. The student stumbled but managed to keep his balance. In the distance, figures began to emerge through the mist, alien soldiers clad in sleek armor, their glowing weapons raised. "Wait," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "Are they real? Are they going to attack me?" "They are echoes of the past," the professor explained. "They will not harm you unless you make the wrong choices. Stay calm, observe, and act with purpose." Easier said than done, he thought as the figures grew closer. Their movements were smooth and calculated, like a well-oiled machine. They didn't seem to notice him yet, but he felt exposed, standing in the open with no weapon or cover. "Where do I go?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Forward," the professor said simply. The student took a deep breath and started walking, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. The soldiers didn't react to him at first. Their attention focused on something further ahead. As he moved closer, he saw what had drawn their focus: a towering machine, shaped like a spire, crackling with energy. "That's the core of this memory," the professor explained. "During the war, these machines were used to disrupt neural communication, crippling entire fleets. My task was to disable one of them, and now it will be yours." His heart sank. "Disable it? How? I don't even know what it is." "Observe. Think. Adapt. You've done it before, and you can do it again." The student clenched his fists, feeling a surge of frustration. Why did she always speak in riddles? But he didn't have time to argue. The soldiers were beginning to spread out, forming a defensive perimeter around the spire. He crouched low, moving behind a piece of metallic debris for cover. From this vantage point, he could see the base of the spire, where several glowing panels pulsed in rhythm. They looked like control units, but he had no idea how to approach them without drawing attention. As he studied the scene, he noticed something strange. The soldiers weren't moving randomly. They followed a precise pattern, their movements perfectly timed. It reminded him of the puzzle in the previous trial. "It's a pattern," he muttered to himself. "Good," the professor said, her voice approving. "You're beginning to see it. The question is, can you use it?" He watched the soldiers for a few more moments, mapping their movements in his mind. There was a small window, just a few seconds, when the path to the spire's base was clear. It wasn't much, but it was his only chance. Taking a deep breath, he waited for the right moment. When the soldiers turned away, he sprinted toward the spire, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground felt unstable beneath his feet, but he didn't stop until he reached the glowing panels. Up close, the spire was even more intimidating. The energy radiating from it made his skin tingle, and the symbols on the panels shifted constantly, as if alive. "Now what?" he asked, his voice shaky. "You must disrupt its core," the professor said. "But be careful. If you make the wrong move, it will react." He stared at the panels, trying to make sense of the symbols. They seemed similar to the ones from the first trial, but more complex. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers hovering over the surface. "Feel the solution," he murmured, repeating the professor's earlier advice. Closing his eyes, he let the patterns wash over him. Slowly, he began to move his hands, pressing the symbols in a sequence that felt right. With each press, the spire's energy seemed to shift, its glow dimming slightly. But just as he thought he was making progress, the ground shook violently. The soldiers turned toward him, their weapons glowing. "Focus," the professor's voice snapped. He gritted his teeth, his fingers flying across the panels. The symbols blurred together, but he didn't stop. Finally, with one last press, the spire let out a deafening hum and shut down, its energy dissipating into the air. The soldiers froze, their forms dissolving into mist. The battlefield began to fade, replaced by a calm, star-filled sky. The professor's voice was steady but firm. "You've done well, but the next trial will push you further. Prepare yourself." The student collapsed to his knees, exhausted but alive. He wasn't sure how much more he could take, but he knew one thing: he had to keep going. The star-filled sky dissolved into a dark void, and the student felt the familiar weightlessness again. This time, however, it was different. The sensation wasn't comforting or peaceful. It was suffocating. He couldn't see anything. No ground, no walls, no light. Just an endless black expanse pressing in from all sides. "Where am I now?" he called out, his voice trembling. "This trial," the professor's voice echoed softly, "is not about logic or resilience. It's about trust." "Trust," he repeated, trying to steady his breathing. Trust in what? In yourself and in others, the professor said cryptically. You won't complete this challenge alone. Before he could ask what she meant, the darkness around him began to shift. Shapes emerged from the void, flickering in and out of existence like shadows caught in a dim light. He squinted, trying to make sense of them, but they were too vague, too fleeting. Suddenly, he felt a presence behind him. He spun around, his heart racing, and found himself face to face with himself. It wasn't an exact reflection. This version of him was dressed differently, in a strange armor that shimmered like liquid metal. His other self's expression was cold, almost calculating, and his eyes glowed faintly with an otherworldly light. What is this? The student stammered, taking a step back. This is a fragment of you, the professor's voice explained. A reflection of your fears, your doubts, your uncertainties. It will act as your guide, or your enemy, depending on the choices you make. The doppelganger smirked, crossing its arms. I'm here to help, it said, its voice eerily similar to his own, but laced with a mocking tone. If you're willing to listen. The student hesitated, unsure if he could trust this version of himself. But before he could decide, the floor beneath his feet solidified, and the darkness around him gave way to a new environment. He was standing in a maze of tall, jagged structures that pulsed faintly with light. The walls seemed to shift and move, their shapes never quite staying the same. In the distance, he could hear a faint, rhythmic pounding, like the beat of a massive heart. You need to reach the center of the maze, the professor's voice instructed. But be warned, this is no ordinary maze. The paths will test your choices, and every wrong step will bring consequences. The doppelganger tilted its head, a sly grin spreading across its face. Don't worry, I know the way. Do you? The student asked warily. Of course, it replied smoothly. After all, I'm you, aren't I? The student hesitated. Could he really trust this shadowy version of himself? But the maze was already shifting, its walls closing in, and he knew he didn't have much time. Fine, he said reluctantly. Lead the way. The doppelganger turned without a word and began walking, its movements confident and deliberate. The student followed closely, his eyes darting around the maze, trying to make sense of its ever-changing paths. At first, the doppelganger seemed to know exactly where to go, turning left, then right, then left again, without hesitation. But as they moved deeper into the maze, the paths became more complex, and the walls seemed to close in tighter. Are you sure this is the right way? The student asked, his unease growing. Trust me, the doppelganger said with a smirk. But something didn't feel right. The rhythmic pounding was getting louder, and the air felt heavier, almost oppressive. Suddenly, the doppelganger stopped and turned to face him. Actually, it said, its grin widening, I think you should take this path instead. It gestured toward a narrow, shadowy corridor that seemed to lead deeper into the maze. The student frowned. Why that way? Because I said so, the doppelganger replied, its tone sharp. Unless you think you know better. He hesitated, glancing down the corridor. Something about it felt wrong, like a trap waiting to spring. But the doppelganger was right about one thing. It was part of him, which meant it might have insights he didn't. Taking a deep breath, he shook his head. No, I don't trust you. The doppelganger's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating glare. Suit yourself, it said, its voice dripping with disdain. Let's see how far you get on your own. Without warning, the doppelganger vanished, leaving the student alone. The maze immediately began to shift, its walls groaning and grinding as they rearranged themselves. The pounding grew louder, and the ground beneath his feet trembled. He felt a surge of panic, but forced himself to focus. Closing his eyes, he tried to tune out the chaos around him and listen to his instincts. The pounding wasn't random. It had a rhythm, a pattern, just like the previous trials. He opened his eyes and began to move, trusting his gut to guide him. Every step felt like a gamble, but slowly the oppressive weight around him began to lift. The pounding grew softer, and the walls stopped shifting. Finally, he reached a clearing at the center of the maze. In the middle of the clearing stood a small pedestal, glowing softly. He approached it cautiously, half expecting another trick, but nothing happened. As he touched the pedestal, the maze dissolved, and the professor's voice returned, calm and steady. "Well done," she said. "You've learned to trust yourself. That is a strength many never master." The student exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. But he knew the trials weren't over yet. Whatever came next, he would face it with the strength he'd begun to find within himself. The maze dissolved into a serene, open field bathed in golden light. A soft breeze carried the scent of wildflowers, and the student found himself standing in the middle of an endless meadow. It was so peaceful, so calm, that for a moment he felt like the trials were finally over. But deep down, he knew better. "Where am I now?" he asked cautiously. "This is the trial of sacrifice," the professor's voice echoed, gentle yet firm. "Here, you will face a decision. The path you choose will determine not just your success, but who you truly are." The student frowned. "Sacrifice. What am I supposed to sacrifice?" "That," the professor said, "is for you to discover." Before he could ask more, the golden light dimmed, and the field began to shift. The grass faded into ash, and the sky turned a dull gray. In the distance, two figures emerged, walking toward him. As they came closer, he recognized them. One was a young girl, no older than 10, with wide, frightened eyes. The other was an older man, his face weathered and worn. Both looked at him with pleading expressions. "Help me," the girl whispered, clutching a small stuffed animal to her chest. Her voice was trembling, full of fear. "No, help me," the man interrupted, his voice rough and desperate. "I can't make it alone." The student's heart sank as he realized what was happening. He was going to have to choose. "These two lives are in your hands," the professor's voice explained. "You may only save one. The other will be lost." "That's not fair," he protested, panic rising in his chest. "Why do I have to choose? There has to be another way." "Life is not fair," the professor said softly. "Sacrifice is not about fairness. It is about making the hardest choices and living with them." The girl's wide eyes filled with tears. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't want to be alone." The man stepped forward, his expression grim. "I've lived a long life, but I'm not ready to give up. Please, don't leave me here." The student's mind raced. How could he possibly make this decision? The girl was so young, with her whole life ahead of her. But the man, what if he had people depending on him? What if his wisdom could save others? He looked at the professor's glowing form in the distance, her presence calm and unyielding. "There has to be another way," he pleaded again. "Can I save both?" "No," she replied firmly. "This is the lesson. Sacrifice requires giving up something precious. There is no easy path." The student clenched his fists, frustration and guilt swirling inside him. He had no idea what the right answer was. Every choice felt wrong. Then he remembered what the professor had said in the previous trials. "Trust yourself." Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath. He blocked out the girl's cries and the man's pleas, trying to focus on what his instincts were telling him. What felt right? When he opened his eyes, he knelt in front of the girl. "I'll help you," he said gently. The man let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I see how it is. The young get all the chances, don't they?" "I'm sorry," the student said, his voice breaking. "I really am." The man's form began to fade, dissolving into golden light. His eyes held a mix of sadness and understanding as he disappeared completely. The field shifted again, returning to its serene, golden state. The girl smiled at the student, her tears drying. "Thank you," she said softly before she, too, vanished. The student was left alone, the weight of his decision pressing heavily on his chest. He sank to his knees, his heart aching. The professor's voice returned, quieter now. "You've passed the trial." He looked up at her, anger and sorrow in his eyes. "But at what cost?" "I feel like I failed, not succeeded." "That is the nature of sacrifice," she said. "It is not about feeling victorious. It is about making the hard choices when no one else can. You trusted yourself, and you acted with compassion. That is why you succeeded." He shook his head, still struggling to accept it. "But I left him behind. How do I live with that?" "You don't forget it," the professor said. "You carry it with you, as a reminder of what it means to bear responsibility. It's a burden, but it also makes you stronger." The student stood slowly, his legs shaky but steady. He didn't feel like he had won, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't the same person who had entered the trials. "What's next?" he asked, his voice quiet but determined. The professor's form began to glow brighter, her outline shimmering against the golden field. "The final trial," she said simply. "Prepare yourself. This will be the greatest test yet." And with that, the world around him dissolved, leaving him to face whatever lay ahead. The student found himself standing in a vast, empty space that stretched endlessly in every direction. The ground beneath his feet was smooth and reflective, like glass, and the air was silent. So silent that he could hear his own heartbeat. He had expected something grand or terrifying for the final trial, but this stillness unnerved him even more. "Is this it?" he called out, his voice echoing strangely. "Where's the challenge?" The professor appeared before him, her form glowing brighter than ever, her expression serene but serious. "This is the final trial," she said. "Here you will face a decision unlike any you've made before." "I'd already made so many hard decisions," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "What more could there possibly be?" Her eyes softened, but her tone remained steady. "This decision will define not just your success, but who you will become. Look behind you." He turned, and his breath caught. Behind him stood his family, his friends, and everyone he cared about. Their faces were filled with hope and trust, their gazes fixed on him. He could feel their belief in him, their unspoken expectation that he would succeed and return to them. "Now look ahead," the professor said. He turned again, and this time, he saw a city unlike anything he had ever imagined. Towering spires reached into the clouds, shimmering with lights and energy. It was a vision of a future so advanced, so full of possibility, that it took his breath away. But the city wasn't empty. He could see countless beings, human and alien alike, living, thriving, and building something extraordinary. What is this?" he asked, his voice trembling. "This is the choice," the professor said. "You can return to your world, to the people you love, and live the life you know. Or you can step into the future, to a world that needs you to help shape it. But know this, you cannot have both. Once you choose, the other will be lost to you forever." The weight of her words hit him like a tidal wave. He looked back at his family and friends, their familiar faces and warm smiles pulling at his heart. Then he turned back to the city, its beauty and promise igniting a spark of curiosity and purpose within him. "How can I possibly decide?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "This is the nature of the final trial," the professor said. "It is not about right or wrong. It is about understanding who you are and what you are willing to sacrifice for your choice." He closed his eyes, his mind racing. If he chose to return, he would have the comfort of his old life, the love of those he cared about. But what if this future city truly needed him? What if he could make a difference that no one else could? He opened his eyes and looked at the professor. "Why me? Why was I chosen for this?" "Because you have the potential to be more than you believe," she said simply. "But potential means nothing without action. This choice is yours alone." The student took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the enormity of the decision. He thought of his family, the moments of joy and love they had shared. Then he thought of the city, of the lives he might touch, the changes he could help create. Finally, he spoke. "If I choose the city, will they remember me?" he asked, glancing back at his loved ones. "No," the professor said gently. "To them, it will be as if you never existed. They will feel no pain, no loss. But if you choose them, the future you see will unfold without you. It may succeed or it may fail. That is the unknown." His chest tightened. Either way, something precious would be lost. He turned back to the professor, his gaze steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I've made my choice." The professor's expression softened, her glow intensifying. "Then step forward and let your journey continue." With one final glance at the two paths, the student stepped forward, his decision made. The world around him shifted, the reflective ground fracturing like shattered glass. Light and sound exploded around him, and for a moment he felt weightless, as though he were being pulled through the fabric of existence itself. When the chaos subsided, he found himself standing in a place he didn't recognize, a world of vibrant energy and endless potential. The professor was gone, but her words lingered in his mind. "You are ready." He looked ahead at the towering city that awaited him and felt a surge of determination. The trials had changed him, shaped him into someone stronger, someone ready to face the unknown. As he took his first step into the future, he knew one thing for certain: he was exactly where he was meant to be.